Nosferatu, a movie retold by David Eden. Chapter 1, The Summoning. The crying started at midnight, as it always did. Ellen pressed her palms against her ears, but the sound burrowed through anyway, not from outside, but from somewhere deeper, somewhere in the marrow of her 16-year-old bones. The nursery walls of her father's country manor seemed to pulse with each sob, the ornate wallpaper writhing in the candlelight like something alive and hungry. She'd been here before. Not just in this room with its too cheerful rocking horse and shelves of porcelain dolls that watched her with glassy, accusatory eyes, but in this moment, this precipice between what she was and what she was becoming. Come to me. The thought wasn't hers. It never was. But tonight, unlike all the other nights when she'd buried her face in goose-down pillows and prayed to a god who seemed as distant as the stars, tonight she answered. Ellen swung her legs over the edge of the bed, her bare feet finding the cold floorboards. The crying intensified, became her own, tears streaming down her face as she clasped her hands together. The words tumbled out, a desperate litany she'd rehearsed in her mind 1,000 times but never dared speak aloud. Come to me, a guardian angel, a spirit of comfort, spirit of any celestial sphere, anything. Her voice cracked, raw with need. Hear my call. The silence that followed was worse than the crying. It pressed against her eardrums, thick as molasses, sweet as rot. Then, like smoke through a keyhole, the whisper came. Not English, not German, not any language that had ever been shaped by human tongues. It was older than that, older than the foundations of the manor, older than the hills that cradled their valley. The shadow at her window didn't arrive. It simply was, as if it had always been there, waiting for her to notice. Ellen rose from the bed, her movements liquid, dreamlike. Her feet no longer touched the floor. She floated inches above it, suspended in the shadow's embrace. It smelled of lilacs. She hadn't expected that. Lilacs and turned earth and something else, something that made her stomach clench with a hunger she didn't understand. You are not for the living, the voice whispered, no longer outside but everywhere, in the air she breathed, in the blood that raced through her veins. You are not for humankind. Yes, she heard herself say, though her lips didn't move. And shall you be one with me ever eternally? Do you swear it? The shadow pressed closer, and Ellen felt herself fragmenting, dissolving, becoming something other than the lonely girl who'd spent countless nights weeping for a comfort that never came. This was what she'd called for, wasn't it? This dark salvation, this terrible mercy. I swear. The garden hit her back with the force of a cathedral bell. One moment she was floating in her nursery, the next she was sprawled among the topiary, soil grinding into her nightgown, her hair. The shadow was no longer gentle. It pressed down on her with the weight of centuries, and what had been bliss curdled into agony. The hand that grabbed her throat wasn't human. In the split second before the world exploded into pain and darkness, Ellen saw what she had summoned, a face that was no face, eyes that were wounds in reality itself, and a hunger that could never be satisfied. Her scream shattered the night like glass. When the gardener found her the next morning, she was half buried in the flower bed, her body racked with convulsions, dirt under her fingernails as if she'd tried to claw her way into the earth itself. Or out of it. They never spoke of what else they found, the strange marks on her throat, the way the lilacs in that corner of the garden bloomed out of season for years afterward, their scent so strong it made visitors sick. Ellen remembered none of it, or so she told them. But sometimes, on nights when the moon was dark and the wind carried the sound of crying that might have been her own, she would wake with the taste of earth in her mouth and the certainty that somewhere something waited, something that had tasted her soul and found it sweet, something that would come back. Chapter 2. The Estate Agent's Proposition. Thomas Hutter woke to find his wife's side of the bed empty and cold. It wasn't the first time. In the 6 months since their wedding, he'd grown accustomed to Ellen's nocturnal wanderings, though accustomed wasn't quite the right word. You could get used to a missing tooth, probing the gap with your tongue 100 times a day, but that didn't mean it ever felt right. Ellen? He sat up, his voice still thick with sleep. Through the warped glass of their bedroom window, the morning sun painted Wisburg in shades of brass and smoke. The harbor bells were already ringing. calling the dock workers to another day of hauling and heaving, the eternal commerce of a port city that never quite slept. He found her by the window, still in her nightgown, her dark hair hanging loose down her back like spilled ink. She was watching something only she could see, her breath fogging the glass in rhythmic pulses. "I dreamt of you," she said without turning. Her voice had that distant quality he'd come to recognize, as if she were speaking from the bottom of a well. "But you weren't there." Thomas felt the familiar knot form in his stomach. The doctors had assured him these episodes would fade with time, with the stability of married life. Melancholia, they'd called it. Female hysteria. Words that explained nothing and helped less. He crossed to her, noticing how Greta, their gray tabby, watched from the bed with eyes that seemed too knowing for a cat. "I'm here now." Ellen turned then, and for a moment her face was that of a stranger, older, hungrier, touched by sorrows he couldn't name. Then she blinked, and she was just Ellen again, his Ellen, reaching for him with pale hands that trembled like moth wings. "The honeymoon was yet too short," she murmured, pulling him close. Her skin was cold despite the warm morning, and she smelled of flowers that shouldn't bloom in December. Thomas let himself be pulled back toward the bed, toward the comfort of her embrace, but the clock on the mantel chimed 7. Her knock. The meeting that could change everything. "I have to go," he said, gently extricating himself. "Today's the day, remember? If all goes well, we'll have that house I promised you, with a garden for Greta and rooms for." He stopped, not wanting to name children that didn't yet exist, might never exist if Ellen's episodes continued. She caught his hand, her grip surprisingly strong. "You mustn't leave. I love you too much." The words should have warmed him. Instead, they felt like a warning. Knock & Associates estate agency squatted on Marienstrasse like a toad made of brick and bad intentions. Thomas had worked there for 2 years, first as a clerk, then as a junior agent, always promising Ellen that better things were coming. Today, finally, they might. The old clerks looked up from their ledgers as he entered, their thick spectacles reflecting the gaslight like the eyes of cave fish. "You have kept him a quarter hour," one wheezed. Thomas could already hear it. That laugh that wasn't quite a laugh, more like steam escaping from a cracked kettle. He followed the sound down the dark corridor, past towers of paperwork that seemed to lean inward, threatening to topple and bury him in an avalanche of other people's deeds and dreams. Her Knock's office door stood slightly ajar. Thomas knocked anyway. Providence. The door flew open, and there was Knock himself, looking like something that had crawled out from under a particularly ambitious rock. "Your delay is Providence, my boy." The office smelled of old paper and something else, something organic and wrong. Knock scuttled back to his desk, his movements too quick, too eager, like a spider who just felt something heavy land in its web. "You've been contracting with us for well over 2 years now, Herr Hooter?" Knock's pen scratched across paper, leaving marks that looked more like wounds than words. "Yes, sir, and I thank you for considering me. When tidings of your recent nuptials but reached my ears, I knew it was Providence. A new husband requires new wages." Knock's eyes glittered with what might have been kindness in a saner face. "Do extend my tardy congratulations to your wife. She is truly a nonpareil of beauty, almost a sylph." The way he said it made Thomas's skin crawl. He'd seen Knock watching Ellen at the Christmas market, his gaze lingering too long, his tongue darting out to wet lips that were already too moist. "Thank you, sir," Thomas managed. "I am most eager to proceed with whatever—" "Foreign count," Knock interrupted, his laugh bubbling up like swamp gas. "Very old line of nobility. Very old. Very eccentric." Papers rustled, and Thomas caught glimpses of writing that hurt to look at. Symbols that seemed to writhe on the page. Wishes to acquire a home in our Wisburg, to retire here. He has one foot in the grave, as they say. More laughter. Thomas thought of Ellen's cold hands, her warnings, and pushed the thoughts away. This was their chance, their only chance. "I should be pleased to escort the gentleman, already selected, Grunewald Manor." "But, sir, isn't that a ruin?" Knock's grin widened, showing too many teeth, or perhaps not enough. It was hard to tell in the dim light. "He seeks an old home and will pay generously. You needs must journey to him. The land beyond the forest." The map Knock produced was old, older than it had any right to be in a modern estate office. Thomas's eyes were drawn to the eastern edge, where civilization ended and the word Transylvania sprawled across the parchment like a warning. Count Orlok, Knox said, and the name seemed to hang in the air like smoke from a funeral pyre. You leave tomorrow. Outside, it had begun to rain. Thomas tucked the bouquet of lilacs he'd bought for Ellen under his coat and ran for home, not knowing he carried more than flowers. He carried the first spores of a plague that would consume everything he loved. In his office, Knock continued to laugh, the sound echoing through the dark corridors of the agency like the promise of a feast to come. Chapter 3. The Land Beyond the Forest. 2 weeks. That's how long it took to reach the edge of the world. Thomas had left Wisburg in what passed for spring, the harbor ice just beginning to crack, Ellen's tears still wet on his collar. Now, as his horse picked its way down a mountain path that seemed designed by a madman or a goat, winter had found him again. Not the honest, German winter he knew, but something older and meaner, full of teeth. The mountains didn't so much rise from the earth as claw their way out of it. Each peak was a broken finger pointing accusingly at a sky the color of old pewter. The trees, what few survived at this altitude, grew sideways, twisted by winds that seemed to blow from somewhere outside the normal compass of direction. Thomas's mare whinnied nervously, her ears flat against her skull. He couldn't blame her. For the last 3 days, since they'd crossed the border into this part of the world that the maps seemed embarrassed to acknowledge, he'd felt it too. That sense of being watched by eyes that weren't quite eyes, of breathing air that had passed through lungs that weren't quite lungs. The village appeared in the valley below, like a fungus in the crook of a dead tree. Thatched roofs huddled together for warmth or protection, smoke rising from chimneys and columns so straight they looked painted on the air. At the center, a wooden church thrust its spire skyward like a plea for help that God had declined to answer. As Thomas descended, the smell hit him, wood smoke and cooking meat, and underneath it all, something wild and gamey that made his stomach twist. Sheep wandered the outskirts of the settlement, their wool gray with more than dust, their eyes reflecting the dying light in ways that reminded him unpleasantly of Ellen's cat. The inn squatted at the village edge, its roof pitched at an angle that hurt to look at, as if the builders had been working from a geometry that predated Euclid. Music spilled from the windows, not the cheerful drinking songs of German taverns, but something with too many notes played on instruments that sounded like they were strung with sinew instead of gut. The yard was chaos. Tents and wagons circled the inn like mushrooms around a rotting stump, and from them poured the Roma, men, women, and children dressed in colors that should have been cheerful but somehow weren't, as if even joy went sour in this place. They swarmed Thomas the moment his boots touched ground. Hands tugged at his coat, his purse, his sanity. The children had eyes too old for their faces, and the women's gold teeth caught the firelight like tiny suns going nova. But it was the man who stood apart that made Thomas's blood slow in his veins. Tall, bearded, wreathed in pipe smoke that didn't smell like any tobacco Thomas knew. He leaned against the inn's porch with the casual arrogance of a wolf that knows the sheep have nowhere to run. When he smiled, it was with his whole face except his eyes. Those eyes looked at Thomas and saw, what, food? Entertainment? Something worse? The laughter started low, just the bearded man's shoulders shaking. Then it spread like a disease through the crowd until everyone was laughing, even the children, even the horses, or so it seemed to Thomas as he stood there, clutching his traveling bag like a talisman against madness. The innkeeper saved him, bursting through the crowd like a man wading through a river of flesh. His mustache was white as bone and seemed to have ambitions of conquering his entire face. He shouted in Romanian, or what Thomas assumed was Romanian. It could have been the language of hell for all he knew. "I need a room," Thomas said in German, then tried again in the few words of Romanian he'd memorized. "One night, I have business at Castle Orlok." The effect was immediate and terrible. The laughter died like something having its throat cut. The innkeeper's face went the color of old milk. Even the bearded man straightened, his smile curdling into something else. "Go," the innkeeper said in German, so accented it sounded like a curse. "Leave here. I'll pay double. Go." But Thomas had come too far. left too much behind. He held up his purse, heavy with the advance Knock had given him, and shook it so the coins sang their universal song. The innkeeper's wife appeared like a wraith from the darkness of the doorway. If her husband's mustache was ambitious, her face had succeeded in becoming something barely human, all nose and chin and eyes that had seen too much. She beckoned with one gnarled finger, and Thomas followed, because what else could he do? The inn's interior was a fever dream of smoke and shadows. Chickens pecked at things on the floor that Thomas didn't want to identify. Men in sheepskin coats sat hunched over drinks the color of old blood, their conversations dying as he passed. The women were anointing the windows with garlic, their prayers rising and falling like the breath of some enormous sleeping thing. His room, when they finally reached it, after a journey through corridors that seemed to double back on themselves, was a monk's cell with pretensions. The bed was built for someone either very tall or very fond of having their feet hang off the end. The single window looked out on nothing but darkness, so complete it might have been painted on the glass. The innkeeper's wife grabbed his hands before he could protest, pressing something into his palm. A wooden cross, crude but heavy, the kind of thing a carpenter might knock together from scraps but put his whole heart into. "Beware his shadow," she said, and her Romanian needed no translation. Fear was a universal language. She passed her hand over his eyes, and Thomas smelled earth and old roses and something else, something that reminded him of Ellen's hair after one of her episodes. "The shadow covers you in nightmare. Awake, but a dream. There is no escape. Pray, pray." She left him with that cheerful thought, crossing herself and spitting on the floor for good measure. Thomas stood there holding the cross, feeling its weight, its rough edges. He'd never been particularly religious. God was something for Sundays and emergencies. But here, in this room that seemed to exist outside the normal flow of time and space, he found himself clutching it like a child with a favorite toy. Outside, something howled. Not a wolf. Thomas knew what wolves sounded like. This was something that had learned to howl by listening to wolves and had gotten the notes right, but the music wrong. He set the cross on the nightstand and began to undress, telling himself he was a modern man, a rational man, a man with a wife to support and a business deal to complete. But when he blew out the candle and darkness rushed in like water through a broken dam, he grabbed the cross again. He fell asleep holding it, and dreamed of Ellen dancing with shadows in a garden that bloomed with flowers made of teeth. Chapter 4. The Covenant of Blood. Thomas woke to the sound of something that wanted to be singing, but couldn't quite remember how. The noise drifted through his window like smoke from a fire that burned the wrong color. He lay in the too-tall bed, the wooden cross still clutched in his hand, its edges having left impressions in his palm that looked disturbingly like wounds. The singing, if that's what it was, rose and fell in patterns that made his teeth ache. He went to the window and immediately wished he hadn't. A procession of torches wound through the birch grove beyond the inn, the flames painting the white bark in shades of hell. At its head, naked as the day she was born, but infinitely more disturbing, rode a girl who couldn't have been more than 16. Her dark skin gleamed with oil or sweat or something else, and she swayed on the white horse's back like kelp in an underwater current. Thomas jerked back from the window, his face burning. He was a married man, a respectable man, but something about the scene pulled at him with fishhooks in his brain. Before he could think better of it, he was pulling on his boots, still wearing his nightshirt like some character from a Penny Dreadful. The inn was deserted, or playing at being deserted. Thomas could feel eyes watching from behind cracked doors as he made his way downstairs and out into the night. The cold hit him like a slap from a disappointed parent, but he followed the torches anyway, keeping to the shadows like a thief. The birch grove was a cathedral of white columns under a ceiling of stars that seemed too close, too bright, as if the sky itself was leaning down to watch. The Roma had formed a circle around a patch of disturbed earth, and Thomas recognized the bearded man from earlier holding a black dog on a chain. The dog had extra eyes painted on its head in white, turning it into something that belonged in a fever dream. The old woman conducting the ceremony looked like she'd been carved from a root that had grown in soil watered with nightmares. She raised her arms, and the naked girl slid from the horse with a grace that made Thomas's mouth go dry despite the cold. "Bless this virgin child," the old woman cried in Romany, though Thomas understood it the way you understand thunder, not the words, but the intent. "Guide our stallion to the unclean spirit." The dog went mad, foam flying from its jaws as it strained against the chain. The naked girl stood perfectly still, her face blank as a doll's, while the men began to dig. Thomas knew he should leave. Every rational part of his mind screamed at him to go back to the inn, to pack his things, to ride back to Wisburg and tell Herr Nock the deal was off. But he stayed, crouched behind a tree like a child spying on adults as they pulled something from the earth that had no business being there. The corpse was swollen with gases that hadn't come from normal decomposition. Its face was the color of raw meat left in the sun, and its eyes, God help him, its eyes were open, staring at the stars with an expression of horrible hunger. The women began to wail, a sound that climbed Thomas's spine like a ladder made of broken glass. "Find his tail," the old woman shrieked. "His cloven hooves." But it was just a man, or what had been a man. Thomas could see that even from his hiding spot, just dead meat going bad in the ground. Nothing more. Nothing that should have made the naked girl start to dance, her movements becoming increasingly frantic as the bearded man raised an iron stake. The math was simple and terrible. Thomas saw what was going to happen a second before it did, and that second stretched like taffy in his mind. The stake rose. The corpse lay there, patient as a sacrifice. The dancing girl spun faster, her hair whipping around her face like snakes. "No!" Thomas heard himself shout, stumbling from his hiding place. "By the grace of God!" The bearded man turned, and their eyes met across the grove. For a moment, Thomas saw himself reflected in those dark pupils, a pale, ridiculous figure in a nightshirt and boots, playing at being a hero in a story that had no use for heroes. Then the stake came down. The scream that erupted from the corpse was impossible. Dead men don't scream. Dead men don't arch their backs and claw at the air while black blood fountains from their pierced bellies. Dead men don't. Thomas woke in his bed at the inn, still wearing his boots, his nightshirt soaked with sweat that smelled like grave dirt. Morning light, weak but honest, leaked through the window. A rooster crowed, the sound as normal and welcome as a mother's kiss. Just a dream. Just a nightmare, brought on by exhaustion and the strange food and stranger company. He sat up, running his hands through his hair, laughing at himself for being such a child. Then he saw the mud on his boots. Fresh mud, with bits of birch bark clinging to it. Outside, the inn yard was empty. The Roma camp had vanished like morning mist, leaving only cold fire circles and tracks in the dust that looked too much like letters in an alphabet. Thomas didn't want to learn. His horse was gone too, which the stable boy explained with gestures, and broken German had wandered off in the night. "The pass," Thomas said, pointing east toward the mountains. "Arniek Pass. I need to get there." The stable boy crossed himself and spat, which seemed to be the local equivalent of "good luck with that." So Thomas walked. The road to the pass was less a road and more a suggestion that someone, at some point, had thought about making a road and then decided against it. It wound upward through terrain that belonged on medieval maps marked with "Here be monsters." The trees grew fewer and more twisted until they gave up entirely and left him alone with the rocks and the wind and the growing certainty that he was making a terrible mistake. The sun died behind the mountains like something being smothered with a pillow. Shadows pooled in the valleys, rising like floodwater. And still, Thomas climbed, because what else could he do? He'd come too far to turn back, spent too much of Nock's money, made too many promises to Ellen. Ellen. He tried to picture her face, but all he could see was the naked girl on the white horse, spinning in the torchlight. He shook his head, angry at himself, and that's when he saw it. The shrine at the pass was a madman's art project. Crosses of every size and material had been nailed, tied, and possibly welded to a wooden frame that looked like it was held together by rust and spite. Garlic wreaths hung like scalps. Icons of saints stared out with eyes that had seen too much and decided blindness was preferable. Beyond the shrine, a bridge crossed a chasm so deep the bottom was lost in darkness. On the other side, the road, and he had to use that term loosely, continued into a forest that looked like it had been designed by someone who'd heard of forests but had never seen one and didn't much like the idea. Thomas stood at the bridge's edge, his traveling bag heavy on his shoulder, his heart doing things in his chest that hearts weren't supposed to do. Every instinct screamed at him to turn back. But somewhere behind him was poverty and failure, and somewhere ahead was the money that would make Ellen happy, would make her well, would fix everything that was wrong between them. He closed his eyes and stepped onto the bridge. The carriage was waiting for him on the other side. Thomas didn't remember crossing. One moment he was stepping onto the bridge's rotting planks, the next he was standing at a crossroads in the forest, and the carriage was there as if it had always been there, as if it had been built into the landscape when God was laying the foundations of the world. It was black, of course. These things always were. The horses were black too, but a black that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. They stood perfectly still, not even breathing that Thomas could see, while their tack jangled with bells that sounded like they were ringing somewhere else, and the noise was just visiting. No driver, or if there was, he was hiding so well in the shadows of the high seat that he might as well have been made of shadows himself. The door opened without anyone touching it. Thomas laughed, high and thin. "I suppose you're my ride to the castle?" The horses screamed in answer, a sound that no horse should be able to make. Then the carriage was moving, and Thomas was inside it, though he couldn't remember climbing in. The interior smelled of leather and age and something else, something organic, that reminded him of the thing they dug up in the birch grove. The windows were curtained in material that felt like skin when his hand brushed against it. Outside, shapes that might have been trees, or might have been something worse, flashed by at speeds that made Newton's laws cry. Wolves ran alongside, their eyes reflecting the moon that shouldn't have been full, but was. They kept pace easily, loping through the underbrush with their tongues lolling out like party streamers made of meat. The castle appeared all at once, as if someone had just remembered to put it there. It squatted on its mountain like a gargoyle with pretensions, all broken towers and walls that seemed to lean in different directions, depending on which eye you closed. The bridge to the gate looked like it had been designed by someone who actively hated both bridges and the people who used them. Thomas closed his eyes just for a moment, just to gather himself. When he opened them, he was standing before the castle's main door, the carriage nowhere to be seen. The wolves had vanished too, though he could hear them singing somewhere in the darkness, a song about meat and moons and things that walked on two legs but shouldn't. The door opened before he could knock, and in the courtyard beyond, lit by a moon that painted everything the color of old bone, stood a figure that Thomas's eyes didn't want to acknowledge. Too tall, too thin, too still, like someone had tried to draw a man from memory but had gotten the proportions wrong in ways that mattered. Count Orlok. Thomas had found him, or perhaps it was the other way around. Chapter 5. The Feast of Shadows. The thing that called itself Count Orlok moved like a marionette operated by a drunk puppeteer who'd learned his trade from spiders. Thomas followed at what he hoped was a respectful distance, though in truth he would have preferred to be in another country entirely. The Count, and Thomas's mind insisted on the capital letter, as if this creature had earned it through sheer wrongness, led him through corridors that seemed to exist in defiance of architecture. Walls met at angles that would have given Pythagoras nightmares. Stairs climbed up and somehow also down. The ceiling was either very high or very low, depending on which fear was winning in Thomas's racing mind. "You are late," Orlok said, and his voice was like something being dragged across broken glass, wrapped in velvet. "The midnight hour is past, and my attendants have all retired." Attendants? Thomas looked around the empty, crumbling castle and wondered if the Count meant the rats he could hear scuttling in the walls, or perhaps the shadows that seemed to move independently of any light source. "Forgive me, Count," Thomas managed, his own voice sounding thin and foreign in the oppressive atmosphere. The Count disappeared. Not walked away, not stepped through a doorway. Disappeared, like a candle flame in a sudden wind. Thomas stood alone in the corridor, his heart doing a credible impression of a rabbit trying to escape a trap. Then he saw the open door, spilling pale light into the darkness like pus from a wound. The great hall beyond was a fever dream of faded grandeur. Candlelight flickered on stones that sweated moisture despite the cold, and the lead glass windows were cracked in patterns that looked almost like script, as if the castle itself was trying to write a warning. A table dominated the center of the room, set for a feast that belonged in another century. Food covered every inch, roasted meats that glistened with fats, fruits that looked too perfect to be real, bread that steamed as if fresh from ovens moth. Thomas couldn't imagine existing in this ruin. All of it for him alone, apparently, as only one place was set. "Leave there your conveniences," the Count's voice came from everywhere and nowhere. "Set out the deed, and sit." Thomas finally spotted him, a shadow among shadows in the far corner of the room. Even at this distance, something was profoundly wrong about his proportions. His back was hunched, but his chest thrust forward, like a mantis pretending to be human. The rich black of his clothing looked less like fabric and more like holes cut in reality. "Would you not wish to wait till morning?" Thomas asked, setting his satchel on the table with hands that only shook a little. "I wish you to do as I request." The words overlapped his own, as if Orlok had known what he would say and had grown impatient waiting for him to say it. "Yes, of course, sir." "Lord," the correction cracked like a whip. Thomas felt his cheeks burn with embarrassment and something else. A child's fear of being caught doing something wrong by an adult whose rules you didn't understand. "Your lord," Orlok continued, and now there was something almost amused in that terrible voice. "I will be addressed as the honor of my blood demands it." Blood. Why did he have to mention blood? Thomas fumbled with the papers, the legal documents that seemed absurdly mundane in this setting. What was a deed of sale in a place where the walls breathed and the shadows had weight? But he spread them out anyway, the familiar ritual of business providing a tiny island of sanity. "Pray, sit," Orlok commanded. Thomas sat. The chair was too tall, making him feel like a child at the adult's table. The food smelled wonderful and wrong, like flowers at a funeral. He reached for a piece of bread, more for something to do with his hands than from any appetite. That's when Orlok moved. Thomas had been watching him, or trying to. It was hard to focus on the Count directly, as if his eyes kept sliding off. But somehow Orlok crossed the vast hall in the space between one heartbeat and the next. One moment he was a distant shadow, the next he was right there, close enough that Thomas could smell him. The stench hit like a physical blow. Not rot, exactly, though that was part of it. This was older, deeper, the smell of earth that had never known sunlight, of crypts that had been sealed before Christ was born, of things that had fermented in darkness until they became something else entirely. A withered hand reached past Thomas's shoulder, and he watched in horrified fascination as fingers that looked more like ivory twigs wrapped around an ancient decanter. The nails were long and yellow, ridged like old horn, and they clicked against the glass with a sound that made Thomas's teeth ache. Wine poured into his chalice, thick and dark as old blood. "Drink," Orlok commanded, and he was gone again, back in his throne-like chair at the far end of the table, as if he'd never moved at all. Thomas drank, because what else could he do? The wine tasted of iron and nightmares, and something sweet underneath, like fruit that had gone past ripe into something else. It coated his throat, warm and somehow alive. Orlok read through the documents with an intensity that would have been comical if it wasn't so unsettling. His face, what Thomas could see of it in the candlelight, was a geography of wrong angles. Cheekbones too sharp, jaw too long, forehead too high. And yet, underneath the corpse-like pallor and the inhuman proportions, there was something almost beautiful about him. The way a spider is beautiful when you're watching it from behind glass. "I have questions," Thomas heard himself say, "about the unfamiliar customs of the peasantry." "Yesternight was but the eve of their St. Andras," Orlok interrupted, still reading. "Our common people say it is the darkest witching night when devil's magic bids the wolf to speak with tongues of men, and every nightmare freely treads upon this earth, ascendant from the torturous grave." The words hung in the air like smoke from a pyre. Thomas thought of the screaming corpse in the birch grove, of the naked girl dancing in the torchlight, and shivered. These gypsies, he pressed on, desperate for some rational explanation, they exhumed a corpse. Orlok's stillness became something terrible. The temperature in the room dropped so fast Thomas could see his breath. "Speak not of it again." The Count's voice filled the hall, echoing from stones that had heard worse screams. Somewhere in the darkness above, things that might have been birds, or might have been bats, stirred and chittered. Then, as quickly as it had come, the rage passed. Orlok's breathing, and God, that breathing, wet and labored like something drowning in its own lungs, slowly calmed. "How I look forward to retiring to your city of a modern mind," he said, and there was something almost wistful in his tone. "Who knows nothing of, nor believes any such morbid fairy tales." The way he said fairy tales made it clear he knew they were anything but. They sat in silence then, predator and prey, though Thomas was beginning to understand that his role in this dance had been decided long before he'd left Wisburg. He forced himself to cut the bread, to chew, to swallow, while Orlok watched him with eyes that reflected the candlelight like a cat's. "You are married, Herr Hutter?" The question came just as Thomas was relaxing, thinking perhaps he could survive this, could complete his business and leave. The bread turned to ash in his mouth. Before he could answer, a clock somewhere in the castle's bowels began to chime. 4 o'clock. The sound was wrong, like bells made of bone, and as Thomas flinched, the knife slipped. Blood welled from his thumb, bright and shocking against his pale skin. Orlok's entire being focused on that single drop of red. His breathing, already labored, became something animal. The papers in his hands crumpled as his fingers spasmed, and his eyes. Thomas looked into those eyes and saw hunger so vast it could swallow the world. "Take heed what you do," Orlok whispered, but it sounded more like a warning to himself than to Thomas. "It's nothing," Thomas said, bringing his thumb to his mouth instinctively. "I might ease your wound." The offer slithered across the space between them like something with too many legs. Orlok was standing now, moving forward with that horrible spider puppet gait. 6 feet away, he stopped, still mostly hidden in shadow, but Thomas could feel the wanting radiating from him like heat from a forge. The Count was shaking, actually shaking, like an addict faced with his drug of choice. The air between them crackled with tension, so thick Thomas could taste it, metallic and wrong on his tongue. "Come by the fire," Orlok said finally, turning away with what looked like physical pain. "Your face shows you unwell." Thomas followed on legs that felt like water, letting himself be led to chairs by a fireplace that cast no heat despite the flames. He was exhausted suddenly, the adrenaline that had kept him upright draining away like blood, his mind supplied helpfully. He fell into the chair, and Orlok loomed over him, still breathing that terrible, wet breathing. The firelight did things to his face that Thomas's eyes refused to process properly. For a moment, just a moment, the gargoyles supporting the mantel seemed to turn their stone heads to watch. "I must tell you," Thomas mumbled, his tongue thick, "about my wife." But the words wouldn't come. The room was spinning now, or maybe he was spinning, and the room was staying still. Orlok was raising his arms, and they seemed to go on forever, reaching up and up until they touched the ceiling, reached through it, touched the sky, blotted out the stars. The last thing Thomas saw before the darkness claimed him was Orlok's face, finally revealed in the firelight. It was the face of hunger given form, of appetite dressed in skin that fit like a badly tailored suit. It was beautiful and terrible, and utterly, utterly wrong. Then Orlok lunged, and Thomas learned what it felt like to be devoured. He woke on the cold stone floor with dawn light creeping through the cracked windows like a thief. His collar was undone, his shirt partially open, and his chest ached with a pain that went deeper than flesh. When he looked down, he saw them. 2 puncture wounds over his heart, perfect as a snake bite, but larger, angrier. The great hall was empty, ruined, as if no feast had ever been laid there. Dust and rubble covered everything, and the only sound was the skittering of rats in the walls and his own ragged breathing. Thomas pressed his hand to the wounds and felt something fundamental inside him shift, like a door opening in a room he hadn't known existed. Somewhere in the castle, something laughed. Chapter 6. The Shadow's Bride. Ellen Hutter stood at the window of the Harding house and felt herself drowning in moonlight. It had been 3 weeks since Thomas left. 3 weeks of letters that had stopped coming after the first fortnight. 3 weeks of Anna Harding's worried glances and Friedrich's increasingly strained politeness. 3 weeks of pretending she couldn't feel the darkness gathering in the east like storm clouds made of teeth and hunger. The honeymoon was yet too short, she whispered to her reflection in the glass, watching her breath fog the window in patterns that looked almost like writing. Behind her, Anna set down her needlework with a soft sigh. Dear Anna, 8 months pregnant with her third child and still trying to mother everyone in sight, including the friend who'd shown up on her doorstep like a stray cat that might be rabid. Leni, Anna said, using the pet name from their childhood, back when Ellen's strangeness had seemed charming rather than dangerous. Won't you come away from there? The night air isn't good for you. Ellen almost laughed. The night air was the least of her problems. The night itself was the issue, the way it pressed against the windows like something trying to get in, the way it whispered her name in languages that predated human speech. He's out there, Ellen said instead. Somewhere. I can feel him. Of course Thomas is out there. He's probably negotiating brilliantly with some old count, charming him with that earnest way he has. Anna's voice was forcefully bright, the verbal equivalent of lighting candles against the dark. He'll be home before you know it. But Ellen wasn't talking about Thomas, and they both knew it. The girls were upstairs, supposedly asleep, but probably whispering about the monster under their beds. They had no idea how right they were. Children always knew, didn't they? They could smell the wrongness on her like cats could smell sickness. Tell me again about the ships, Ellen said, still watching the harbor lights twinkle in the distance like fallen stars. Tell me how they come home. Anna rose with difficulty, one hand supporting her swollen belly, and came to stand beside her. She smelled of lavender and milk and all the normal things Ellen had forgotten how to be. They follow the stars, Anna said softly. The North Star especially. Sailors have used it for thousands of years to find their way home. But what if home is moved? What if the stars are lying? Anna's hand found hers, warm and solid and real. Stars don't lie, Leni. People do sometimes, and the sea does always, but stars are constant. Ellen wanted to tell her friend that she was wrong, that there were older stars that sang different songs, stars that had watched things crawl out of primordial darkness and decide to walk upright, stars that remembered when the world was young and hungry and honest about it. But Anna's pregnancy made her fragile in ways that had nothing to do with her body, so Ellen just squeezed her hand and said nothing. That night, it started. Ellen woke, if you could call it waking, when she'd never really been asleep, to find herself standing in the upstairs hallway. Her nightgown was soaked with sweat despite the December cold, and her bare feet had left damp prints on the floor like something that had crawled up from the sea. She could hear Anna and Friedrich making love in their bedroom, trying to be quiet for the sake of the children and the guest who wasn't quite right in the head. The sound should have embarrassed her. Instead, it made her hungry in ways that had nothing to do with flesh. Her feet moved without her permission, carrying her down the stairs with a grace that wasn't hers. The front door opened at her touch. Had she touched it? And then she was outside, the cobblestones ice against her soles, the night air filling her lungs like water. The shadow was waiting for her at the edge of the quay. Not a shadow cast by anything as mundane as a body-blocking light. This was shadow with substance, shadow with intent, shadow that remembered her smell from 16 years ago and had crossed half a continent to find it again. Soon I will be no more a shadow to you, the voice whispered in her mind, in that ancient tongue that bypassed her ears entirely. Your spirit was never enough. Soon our flesh shall embrace and we shall be as one. No, Ellen whispered, but her body was already responding, her breath quickening, her skin flushing with heat that had nothing to do with shame and everything to do with recognition. She knew this feeling. She'd been born knowing it, the way some people were born knowing how to swim. You are promised to me. The shadow reached for her, and she saw, no, felt, fingers that were too long, too thin, too everything. They wrapped around her throat like a collar she'd been measured for before birth. The touch was electric, shooting through her nerves like lightning made of need. Thomas, she gasped, the name a talisman against the dark. The shadow recoiled as if burned. Then, from somewhere that wasn't quite here, but wasn't quite elsewhere either, came a laugh that sounded like grave dirt settling. The broker has sold you for gold. The contract is signed. Ellen! The real world crashed back like a bucket of cold water. Friedrich stood in the doorway of the house, half-dressed and wild-eyed, with Anna behind him, clutching a robe around herself. A servant held a lantern that pushed back the darkness, but couldn't quite banish it. Ellen found herself at the very edge of the quay, one more step from tumbling into the black water of the canal. Her nightgown was rucked up around her thighs, her hair wild, her body positioned in a way that spoke of interrupted intimacy with something that wasn't there. Or wasn't there anymore. My God, Friedrich breathed, and Ellen could see herself reflected in his horrified eyes. The madwoman who'd been about to throw herself into the canal, or worse, who'd been meeting a lover who existed only in her diseased mind. They brought her inside, Anna clucking and fussing, while Friedrich sent for Dr. Sievers. Ellen let herself be led, dressed, put to bed like a child who'd had a nightmare. But she could still feel the shadow's touch on her throat, could still taste the promise of something vast and terrible and absolutely, utterly inevitable. Dr. Sievers arrived within the hour, all professional concern and barely concealed fascination. He was the kind of man who'd become a doctor because bodies were puzzles and he liked taking things apart to see how they worked. Somnambulism, he pronounced after examining her, his fingers cold and clinical on her wrist. Sleepwalking brought on by an excess of blood. Perhaps she was oppressed in a somewhat odd position beforehand. Ellen wanted to laugh. Oppressed in an odd position? If only he knew. She'd been oppressed since birth by the knowledge that she belonged to something that wore human shape the way other people wore ill-fitting clothes. She should sleep in her corset, Sievers continued, addressing Friedrich as if Ellen wasn't there. It encourages the correct posture, calms the womb, and revives circulation. Calm the womb, as if her womb was the problem, and not the fact that something ancient and hungry had marked her before she'd even known what marking meant. And if her stirring escalates, Sievers added with what he probably thought was humor, you can always tie her to the bed. Friedrich's laugh was strained. Anna's hand found Ellen's under the covers, a small gesture of solidarity that made Ellen want to weep. Sweet Anna, who had no idea that the thing calling to Ellen would devour her whole family just for the crime of being in the way. The nights that followed blurred together like watercolors in rain. Ellen would wake to find herself in different parts of the house, always moving toward windows, toward doors, toward any gap where shadow might seep in. The Hardings took to locking her in at night, and she let them, because the alternative was explaining that locks meant nothing to the thing that called her. Then came the night when the pretense ended. Ellen stood at the window, that damned window that seemed to attract her like iron filings to a magnet, and felt the familiar pull. But this time, it was different. Stronger, more insistent. Like the difference between someone knocking on your door and someone breaking it down. He was coming. Not in shadow, but in flesh. Coming to claim what had been promised to him by a lonely, desperate child who hadn't understood that some gifts come with price tags written in blood. He is coming, she whispered, and her voice harmonized with itself in ways human throats shouldn't allow. He is coming to me. In the harbor, she could see lights that shouldn't be there, a ship arriving in weather that should have kept any sane captain in port, a ship that moved too fast, pushed by winds that blew from somewhere outside the normal compass of meteorology. Behind her, she heard Anna stir in the bed they'd taken to sharing, Friedrich having moved to the guest room because his pregnant wife needed rest, and Ellen needed watching. Lenny? Anna's voice was thick with sleep and worry. What is it? Ellen turned, and for a moment she saw herself as Anna must see her, pale as bone, eyes too bright, standing at the window like a bride waiting for a bridegroom who traveled by hearse instead of carriage. I must tell you something, Ellen said, her voice steady for the first time in weeks, about what happened when I was young, about what's coming now. Anna sat up, one hand protectively over her belly. Even in the moonlight, Ellen could see the fear in her friend's eyes. Fear of her, fear for her, fear of the truth that was about to spill from Ellen's lips like blood from a wound. "There was a night," Ellen began, "when I was so alone I thought I might die from it, and I called out to anything that would listen, and something answered." In the harbor, the ghost ship drew closer, and Ellen felt the shadow that had visited her dreams take on weight and substance and terrible, terrible purpose. Count Orlok had arrived in Wisburg, and somewhere across the city she felt Thomas wake screaming. Chapter 7. The Blood Ship. Thomas Hutter had been dead for 3 days before he noticed. Not dead in the way that mattered to coroners and gravediggers, but dead in the ways that counted. Dead to hope, dead to sanity, dead to any future that didn't end with teeth in his throat and his blood painting the castle stones. He wandered Orlok's castle like a ghost haunting his own body, checking locked doors he'd checked 100 times before, looking for exits in a building that seemed to reshape itself every night. The bite marks on his chest had turned interesting colors, purple at the edges, black at the center, with little red lines spreading outward like a child's drawing of the sun. They pulsed with his heartbeat, and sometimes, when he wasn't looking directly at them, he could swear they moved. On the third night, the wolves came for him. He'd barricaded himself in the tower room, pushing the massive oak bed against the door in a feat of strength that should have been impossible for someone who'd been living on fear and stale bread for days. But the wolves didn't need doors. They flowed through the cracks like smoke made of teeth and hunger, their eyes reflecting moonlight that couldn't possibly be reaching this deep into the castle. Thomas pressed himself against the window, calculating the drop. Far, too far. But maybe far was better than what those yellow eyes promised. Then he heard it. Orlok's breathing, wet and hungry, coming from everywhere at once. The wolves went silent, lowering themselves to the floor in submission to something worse than themselves. "The broker lives." The voice came from inside Thomas's skull, setting his teeth vibrating like tuning forks. I had cast aside his carrion body for my hellhounds to feed on. Thomas laughed, high and wild. "Sorry to disappoint." The door exploded inward, the bed flying across the room like dollhouse furniture. Orlok stood in the doorway, and for the first time Thomas saw him clearly, without shadow or pretense. The Count was naked, and that was somehow worse than all the teeth and claws and wrong proportions. His skin was the color of things that lived in caves, translucent enough to show the dark mapping of veins underneath. His body was a blasphemy of anatomy, too tall, joints in places where joints shouldn't be, muscles that moved independently like creatures trying to escape from under his skin. But it was his face that made Thomas's sanity fold in on itself, like origami made of screams. Beautiful and terrible, ancient and newborn, dead and so terribly, voraciously alive. This was the face that had whispered to Ellen in the dark, that had marked her before Thomas had even been born. "She calls to me," Orlok said, and his voice was almost gentle. "Even now, across all these miles, she calls. Do you know what it is to be called by your true nature, her hooter? To fight it for centuries only to have it sing your name?" Thomas thought of Ellen at their wedding, radiant in white, whispering, "I choose you," with tears in her eyes. He thought of her warnings, her episodes, her fear that had never quite been fear enough. "You can't have her," he said. Orlok smiled, showing far too many teeth. "I have always had her. You were merely borrowing." The attack came faster than thought. One moment Orlok was in the doorway. The next he was on Thomas, lifting him like a child's toy. The room spun, reality blurred, and Thomas felt himself dissolving into sensation, pain and ecstasy mixed until he couldn't tell where one ended and the other began. Then, through the haze of his own destruction, he heard something that made Orlok pause. A ship's horn, echoing up from the valley below. Orlok dropped him, moving to the window with inhuman grace. Far below, winding through the mountain passes, a line of wagons moved like funeral procession. Thomas could just make out the coffin-shaped boxes they carried, each one marked with a seal that hurt to look at, even from this distance. "The Empusa set sail at dawn," Orlok murmured, more to himself than to Thomas, "and I must rest in native soil for the journey." He turned back to Thomas, and for a moment there was something almost like regret in those terrible eyes. "You should have died cleanly, broker. Now you will linger, knowing what comes." Then he was gone, not through the door, but simply gone, as if he'd never been more than a nightmare Thomas was finally waking from. Thomas lay on the floor, gasping, bleeding, more alive than he'd ever been, and wishing he wasn't. Outside, the wolves howled their disappointment to a moon that didn't care. He crawled to the window and made his choice. The fall was exactly as far as he'd calculated, but the river at the bottom was a mercy he hadn't dared hope for. Captain Yusov had been sailing for 30 years, and in that time he'd carried cargo that would have made customs officials weep: guns for revolutionaries, opium for merchants, once a hold full of exotic animals for some mad collector's menagerie. But he'd never carried anything that felt wrong the way these boxes felt wrong. They'd loaded them in the dead of night, the client's representative, a little man who laughed too much and smelled of rendered fat, paying triple the usual rate in gold coins, so old they bore the faces of emperors Yusov couldn't name. 6 boxes, each one wrapped in enough canvas and rope to hide whatever was inside, each one bearing a wax seal that seemed to squirm when you weren't looking directly at it. Artifacts, the little man had said, giggling. Very old, very fragile, must not be disturbed. Yusov had taken the gold because he had 3 daughters and a wife who deserved better than a husband who came home reeking of salt and other men's cargo. But now, 5 days out of port with his destination still weeks away, he was beginning to think some gold wasn't worth earning. It started with the rats. Every ship had rats. It was a fact of life, like barnacles and bad food. But the rats on the Empusa were different. They moved in formations like tiny armies. They watched the crew with eyes that reflected light that wasn't there, and they all seemed to flow toward and away from the cargo hold in patterns that hurt to think about. Then Vasiliev disappeared. One night he was on watch. The next morning his post was empty, a dark stain on the deck, the only sign he'd ever been there. The stain looked like blood but smelled like flowers, lilacs specifically, though they were 1,000 miles from anywhere lilacs grew. Fell overboard, Yusov told the crew, because what else could he say? That something in the hold was drinking his men like wine? That he could hear breathing coming from those sealed boxes, wet and hungry and patient as death? Rudenko went next, found in the hold with his throat torn out and his face frozen in an expression of ecstasy that made Yusov's stomach turn. The cabin boy they discovered wrapped in rope like a spider's meal, his body drained so thoroughly that he weighed no more than empty clothes. That's when the first mate, Dmitri, decided to take matters into his own hands. Yusov found him standing over the opened crate, axe buried in wood that bled sap the color of old blood. Inside was a coffin, its lid pried open to reveal nothing but earth, dirt that smelled of centuries, of crypts, of things that should stay buried but didn't. Empty, Dmitri whispered, his face pale as sailcloth. It's empty. That's when the shadow fell on him. Yusov would remember that moment for the rest of his life, all 3 minutes of it. The shadow descended like a piece of night that had decided to go into business for itself. It wrapped around Dmitri, and the first mate's scream cut off as something that might have been a mouth but probably wasn't fastened on his throat. When the shadow lifted, Dmitri was a husk, and standing in his place was something that wore the shape of a man, the way a scarecrow wears clothes. Count Orlok looked at Yusov with eyes that had seen the rise and fall of empires, that had watched the first ships set sail and would watch the last ones sink. He was naked, covered in grave dirt and blood, and he smiled with too many teeth. "Continue to Wisberg," he said in a voice like continents grinding together, "or I will pilot this ship myself, and I have not had to learn new things in a very long time." Yusov nodded, his throat too full of prayers to speak. He backed out of the hold, stumbled up to the deck, and gave orders in a voice he didn't recognize as his own. The crew obeyed because the alternative was thinking, and thinking led to madness. The storm hit them 3 days from port. It came from nowhere, or perhaps from wherever Orlok came from. The sky turned the color of old bruises, and the wind howled in languages that predated human speech. Waves tall as buildings crashed over the deck, but somehow the ship held together, pushed forward by forces that had nothing to do with meteorology. Yusov lashed himself to the wheel and steered by instinct and terror. Around him, his remaining crew fell one by one, some to the storm, some to the thing in the hold that had given up all pretense of hiding. He saw Orlok moving across the deck like a piece of the storm itself, untouched by wind or rain, feeding on whoever was too slow to get out of his way. By the time the lights of Wisburg appeared through the storm, Yusov was alone. He aimed the ship at the harbor with the last of his strength, knowing he was bringing death to port, but unable to stop himself. The wheel fought him, wanting to turn back to sea, but something stronger than his own will kept his hands steady. As the Empusa crashed into the dock, splintering wood and scattering the few night workers like ninepins, Yusov felt teeth at his throat. Not painful, not anymore. Almost gentle, like a mother's kiss if mothers had fangs and drank their children dry. "Thank you for your service," Orlok whispered in his ear, and Yusov died thinking of his daughters, hoping they would never know what their father had brought home. Ellen stood at the window of the Harding house and felt the city's first death rattle. It started in the harbor, of course. These things always did. The rats came first, flowing from the wreck of the Empusa like oil from a broken lamp. Then came the sickness, spreading through the dock workers and their families faster than gossip, faster than fear. But underneath the plague, like harmony beneath melody, Ellen felt him. Orlok, no longer a shadow, but flesh and bone and terrible purpose. He was in the city now, her city, walking streets she'd walked, breathing air she'd breathed. "He's here," she whispered, and somewhere across Wisburg, Thomas fell from a monastery horse, finally home and far, far too late. Chapter 8. The Wedding of Shadows. Ellen Hutter dressed for her wedding night with the care of someone who knew it would also be her funeral. The dress had waited in its trunk like a patient ghost, smelling of lavender and lost hopes. She'd worn it only once before, on a day that now seemed to belong to someone else's life. Some other girl who'd believed that love could conquer darkness, that vows spoken in daylight were stronger than promises made in shadow. Now she knew better. The city was dying around her. Through the window of the empty house, empty because Thomas had dragged himself off with the other men to hunt something that didn't want to be found, she could see the funeral pyres burning. The plague had taken Wisburg in its teeth and was shaking it like a terrier with a rat. Anna was dead, sweet pregnant Anna, whose only crime had been kindness. The children, too, their small bodies light as birds when Friedrich had carried them to their tomb. Ellen fixed dried lilacs in her hair with steady hands. The flowers crumbled at her touch, but that seemed appropriate. Everything beautiful became dust in the end. Everything except the hunger that had been singing in her bones since she was 16 years old. You were never meant for the living, the shadow had told her all those years ago, and only now did she understand what that meant. She'd tried to be human, tried so hard it had nearly torn her apart. But trying to be something you're not is like holding your breath. Eventually, you have to inhale. A sound on the stairs. Not footsteps exactly, more like the memory of footsteps, the idea of someone climbing toward her. The temperature dropped so fast, frost formed on the windows, and Ellen's breath came out in clouds that shaped themselves into words she didn't want to read. "I'm ready," she said to the empty room that wasn't empty anymore. Orlok filled the doorway like smoke fills a bottle. He dressed for the occasion too, in clothes that belonged to a century when people understood that death was just another suitor come calling. His face, that terrible, beautiful face, showed something that might have been triumph, or might have been sorrow, or might have been both braided together like her hair. "You accept this," he said in the old tongue, the first tongue, the language spoken before humans learned to lie. "Of your own will?" Ellen turned from the mirror where she'd been watching him not reflect. "I've always accepted it. I just spent 20 years pretending otherwise." He crossed the room in that flowing way he had, as if the air itself parted to let him pass. This close, she could see what he truly was. Not a man, not a monster, but something that existed in the space between, something that fed on that gap between what we are and what we fear we might become. "Your husband seeks to destroy me," he said, one ancient finger tracing the line of her jaw. "Even now he scurries through the ruins of Grunewald Manor, driving stakes into empty coffins. Let him." Ellen caught his hand, pressed it to her cheek. His skin was cold as truth. "We both know there's only one way this ends." Something flickered in Orlok's eyes. Surprise, perhaps, or recognition. You've read the books. I've always known. The same way I knew you'd come back. Some things are written in blood before we're born. Outside, she could hear the sound of horses, of men shouting. Thomas's voice rose above the others, cracked with exhaustion and rage. They'd found Knock in the coffin, found the burning manor, found everything except what they were looking for. Because what they were looking for was already here, in this room that smelled of lilacs and endings. Orlok's hands framed her face with terrible gentleness. I could make you like me, eternal, hungry but never dying. And spread this plague forever? Ellen shook her head. That's not love. That's just appetite dressed up in poetry. His laugh was the sound of crypts opening. You would lecture me on love? I who have forgotten more about longing than your species will ever learn. Then remember this, Ellen said, and kissed him. It was like kissing winter, kissing famine, kissing the space between stars. His mouth tasted of iron and eternity, and Ellen felt herself fragmenting, each piece reflecting a different hunger. The 16-year-old who'd called out in loneliness. The bride who'd sensed shadows at her wedding. The woman who'd walked in her sleep toward something that walked in her dreams. They moved to the bed like dancers following choreography written in the world's foundation. Ellen lay back on sheets that would never be white again, and Orlok followed, his weight both nothing and everything, pressing down like centuries of earth. You know what sunrise brings, he whispered against her throat. I'm counting on it. His teeth found her breast, piercing silk and skin with equal ease. The pain was exquisite, transforming immediately into something else, something that made her understand why the French called it the Little Death. She arched beneath him, her hands tangling in his hair, holding him close as he drank. This was what she'd been born for. Not Thomas's gentle love, not children and gardens and all the pretty lies humans told themselves. This union of ecstasy and oblivion, this marriage of blood and shadow. She felt herself flowing into him, all her memories and dreams and hungers mixing with his ancient appetite. She saw through his eyes. Centuries of darkness, empires rising and falling, always alone until a lonely girl's call had pierced his death sleep like a fishhook through a lip. The first light of dawn crept through the windows like a thief. Orlok felt it and tried to pull away, but Ellen held him fast. She was stronger now, or he was weaker, or perhaps strength and weakness meant nothing when you were dissolving into each other. More, she whispered. All of it. He drank deeper, unable to resist, and Ellen felt herself becoming hollow, translucent, a vessel emptying itself to be filled with light. Through the growing haze, she heard footsteps on the stairs. Thomas, always too late, always trying to save what was already lost. The door burst open just as the sun cleared the harbor. Ellen! She turned her head, met her husband's horrified eyes, and smiled. There was blood on her lips, blood on her breast, blood soaking into the wedding dress like spilled wine. But her face was peaceful, beatific, the face of a saint achieving martyrdom, or a sinner finding absolution. Orlok screamed as the sunlight touched him. Not a human scream, but the sound of stone cracking, of ice breaking, of all the dark spaces in the world crying out at once. He writhed, trying to escape, but Ellen's arms were iron, were gravity, were the promise he'd extracted from a lonely girl finally coming due. They died together as the sun rose over Wisburg. Thomas fell to his knees beside the bed, reaching for Ellen's hand as the life faded from her eyes. She squeezed his fingers once, gently, a goodbye that said, I'm sorry and thank you, and this is how it was always going to end. Orlok crumbled like old parchment, like dried flowers, like dreams exposed to daylight. Within moments there was nothing left but dust and the echo of a hunger that had outlived its time. Professor von Franz stood in the doorway, hat in hand, watching the morning light pour through the windows. He scattered lilacs over the bed, covering the mingled remains of beauty and beast, love and appetite, the bride who'd married death to save the living. In the harbor, ships began to move again. In the streets, the dying took one more breath. In the sky, the sun rose clean and bright, burning away the shadows that had held Wisburg in their grip. Ellen Hutter was dead, but the world was alive, and somewhere in the mathematics of sacrifice and salvation, that balanced the ledger. Thomas knelt by the bed until the others made him leave, holding the hand of a woman who'd loved him enough to choose someone else. He would live, because that's what the living do. He would mourn, because that's what love demands. And sometimes, on nights when the moon was dark and the wind carried the scent of lilacs, he would wake to find the space beside him cold and know that some hungers outlive even death. But the plague was over, the shadows were empty, and the morning was bright with the kind of light that makes promises it intends to keep. In the end, that had to be enough. Because in the end, it was all there was.